But just to sort of introduce myself, my name is Liam Curran, and I'm a lecturer, recent lecturer with the University of Huddersfield, and that's lecturing in professional policing. So I can, if anyone has questions around, detail around the courses, I studied with Huddersfield on the criminology course, and I've also done some work on the Police Now program that we did, and as well as our professional policing degree and policing investigations course as well. So hopefully I should be able to give you a bit of a all-round response to any questions you might have. But today, primarily what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking about, a really niche and unique area around undercover policing. Well, undercover policing itself, really unique and niche area of policing. It's not something that we often talk about in terms of policing as one of its sort of, it's a really important role, has massive implications, but also there's not really a lot around the well-being of undercover and covert police officers. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to sort of present a bit of my research into undercover policing, the well-being of covert and undercover police officers, but as well just sort of give some brief background information into sort of how it works, how it's set up, things like that. Um, the nature of the topic, of course, it's very hidden. It's something that's very sort of hidden from the rest of policing, even. It has to be by its nature incredibly secret. So what I shall do is, I do have a clip, a brief video clip, like 30 seconds. There's a bit of bad language in it. There's one F word, one F bomb. Um, Apologies if that offends anyone. But it's just to sort of demonstrate some of my findings as well. Nothing violent or anything like that. So what I shall do is I shall share my screen, and if Lindsay, you could confirm that we can see that.
Yep, you're all good. I can see that.
Perfect, brilliant. Okay, feel free to interrupt me, Lindsay, if you need to go or anything like that, just so I know. But yeah, I'll make a start. So, as I've mentioned, my work in this area has been around primarily the well-being of former covert and undercover police officers. Believe it or not, undercover police officers are a population that are incredibly difficult to access for researchers. So, what I'd like to cover today is, a brief introduction as to what covert and undercover policing is, you know, how it's used, where it's used, what the tactics are, um, sort of give a brief background into the research, some of the previous literature that's been covered in this area. Uh, Hint, not a lot, really. And I'll sort of be going through what I did in terms of my research, how I done it, things like that. And obviously I'll be taking questions at the end. So when we think of undercover policing, just think about what springs to mind. Now, to me, what springs to mind, if the images come up, that's Sherlock Holmes, the very first version of it, Basil Rathbone back in the 1930s, very famous for sort of undercover disguises, things like that in his cases. This next picture, the bottom left, is from one of my all-time favorite films, Donnie Brasco, which is sort of a true story of an FBI agent called Joseph Pistone who infiltrated the American mafia. And the one on the top left, that's Leo DiCaprio, and that's from a movie called The Departed from around 2004. So these are all sort of fictional media, sort of things around undercover policing, which sort of got me onto the topic, really. So, what is undercover policing? We might like to think of it as sort of working from the inside, gathering that long-term information and intelligence. And it's very much a proactive form of policing. It's It's not like sort of a police officer responding to a 999 call in action. It's, it's responding long term to criminal offending or potential offending later on. And it's, quite a lot of it is where an officer, in order to be effective to do the role, it's concealing the true identity. Um, so that's some of the ways we might like to think about undercover policing. It's very, very different to what we typically consider as policing. Now, there are a few different sort of types of police work. As I've mentioned, there's the more, hold on, I want my laser pointer here because that helps with this slide. So police actions, we tend to think of police actions as overt. Now, what that means is it's sort of visible, you can see it, it's obvious. One example being a uniformed patrol officer, whereas sort of covert can relate to sort of passive surveillance. So, that's sort of wiretapping, bugging people's phones, watching, taking photographs, watching on surveillance, things like that. Whereas there are police actions which can be covert, so, hidden, but also can use deception. So basically lies, lying within a police investigation. And that's how we might think about, undercover cops, the undercover agent or police officer. So in the UK, in order to sort of, the legal terminology for an informer, if you like. So, that's somebody who may be part of a criminal gang. They sort of snitch or grass on their, for want of a better word, criminal colleagues. And they are what are called covert human intelligence sources, or CHIS, CHIS. A type of covert human intelligence source is an undercover officer. Of that type of source, there are three. So you can have undercover online operatives. So you may think of those, more frequently in terms of sort of sort of online hunter stings, sort of monitoring drug trafficking, WhatsApp groups and things like that. You can have foundation undercover officers. Foundation undercover officers, they sort of are more about, test purchasing. So sort of they may go to, one drug deal or something like that, posing as a criminal buying drugs to build intelligence. Whereas you have your sort of most advanced undercover officers who, these officers, they require the sort of more intense sort of planning and preparation. They need to have false documents in their name. It might entail sort of going to pubs and bars of people you need to sort of associate with, the criminal gangs perhaps that you associate with. Um, and that requires a lot of that planning and preparation. That's your sort of deepest level of undercover officer type, really. Now, this next slide, it's a bit unwieldy, but effectively along the bottom, we've got sort of the year 2000 to 2018. And along this sort of left-hand column, these are the number of authorizations. Now, these grey bars, these are authorizations for sort of direct surveillance, whereas these dark blue bars, they are the number of authorizations for covert human intelligence sources. The orange one, the orange bars are undercover officers themselves. So there are very few undercover officer authorizations per year. Apologies, that's skipped ahead. By far it's direct surveillance, so they're not used that often. In terms of what they are, what these tactics are used most for, you know, again, by far, undercover sort of policing and covert tactics are used for drug trafficking. So the statistics are quite old now, nearly 10-year old, but the statistics are no longer reported in this way. So these are the sort of latest figures that we have, but we can see most of the time, and it's pretty consistent, undercover policing, sort of undercover tactics are used for drug trafficking. And the next biggest one is sort of this orange bar here, which is money laundering. So by and large, it's, drug trafficking. Now, what my research specifically explored was the well-being, of undercover officers. You know, what are the mental health effects of being an undercover officer on, the mind of somebody who does it? We don't really know a lot, and we can sort of imagine that the stresses are going to be, massively different. Apologies, that's my door, but I can't answer it because I'm working. So what my research intended to do, it was intended to sort of examine stress and coping in undercover officers, former undercover officers. I used sort of a case study approach where I interviewed 5 former undercover or covert cops, and then I sort of done what's called a thematic analysis of all those interviews. So sort of picking apart all the main elements that are coming across all of the interviews that I'd done. So before I embarked on the study, what I found around, the previous academic literature on undercover policing in general is that it's very outdated. It's much more tailored towards the American sphere. A lot of the research is around American undercover cops, and there's not really a lot on the well-being impacts on undercover cops in the UK. But what I also found were that a lot of the stresses were really quite different. Divergent means, different in effect, different stresses to your typical response cop, right? So again, how I done it, I interviewed 5 former covert and undercover officers, and all of them, in fact, were undercover officers that were largely involved in infiltrating or monitoring sort of criminal drug dealing gangs, if you like, so organized crime groups or OC, excuse me, OCGs in effect. And coming out of those interviews, some of the main themes I found were, the risks to well-being were safety, things like physical danger, identity stresses. That wasn't common, but it was a really interesting finding from one of the cops I spoke to. And I do have some quotes to illustrate all these different elements. In terms of support networks, these were really important. That familial support is really important, but the nature of the work can really get in the way of sort of those family bonds and that support that you get from your family and friends. And support at work, that was difficult because a cop, if you're undercover, you don't, you're not going into the office every day or whatever, you're not associating with your colleagues. Um, and on coping, I found that the officers reflected and ruminated quite a lot in negative ways. There was a lot of alcohol use, which can be sort of linked with, this wider cultural thing around cops using alcohol as a coping mechanism. And again, it's cut off. I've not designed these slides very well, but one important factor was physical activity, getting out and about, doing exercise and things like that. But there were problems to that for one particular officer. So in terms of some quotes, for the quotes around risks to well-being, one undercover officer sort of was threatened with weapons and violence, and they had a car used against them. Somebody tried to run them down, if you like. But the different thing with undercover cops is, you know, where a normal response officer might have the radio with the red button and they can press that for emergency backup, that's not the case with undercover police officers. There's a much greater risk of danger and violence with limited backup. In terms of the identity stressors, one important thing I found was that one officer described to me that because he played all these different roles, this is a direct quote from, he said, now I don't know who I am. I'm nobody. And he was playing the part of he assumed the identity of a heroin addict, and as part of that, he would go running, he would go mountain climbing all the time to sort of make himself look really thin, make himself look gaunt, to fit the picture of being a heroin addict. So that was one of those cases where that physical activity was really quite negative. But he was sort of dealing with this element of confusion around, being a father figure, being a cop, playing the part of a heroin addict. And one thing I'd like to try and test out if it'll work is, this clip is from the movie Donnie Brasco, and it's just 10 or so seconds, and I'm hoping the sound works on this. I don't know if Lindsay's around, but we'll try and see if it works. I'm not too sure it will, but let's just see. Now, the context to this clip is Johnny Depp is sort of explaining, the impact that this is having on his personality, really. So it's just 10 or so seconds. If it wants to work. Okay, I don't think that's going to work because I want to skip quite far ahead and I don't think we have the time for that, but apologies for that. Basically, what he says is, um, he's struggling to sort of fulfill the role, and he says, I'm not becoming like them, the gangsters. He says, I am them. So it's sort of that extreme reaction to, trying to play multiple personalities, if you like. But it's one of them things, we don't know how common it is across undercover police officers. So if you get a chance, watch the film. It's a fantastic film. It's based on a book as well, written by the officer. But particularly this clip for sort of, a good example of the sort of identity impacts that it can have. Apologies that didn't work. It's frustrating because it's a good clip as well. Um, so some of the quotes around support, you know, many of the officers I spoke to said it can, take a massive impact, has a massive impact on your family. And it broke, the marriage of one undercover cop involved. But support at work was actually quite mixed, because one of the cops I spoke to said corruption was massively rife, in their police department, that they had to get shut down. And others were sort of basically said, that they tried to go to their bosses and say, listen, I'm really struggling to deal with all this. And they basically said, you're sort of taking the mick a bit. The phrase he used was swinging the lead. I'd never heard that before. But to take the mickey, basically, and sort of, that person had really negative experiences with support at work. Now, the quotes on coping, reflection, again, that was used positively and negatively by sort of, the reflective negatively on their experiences. But if we think back to how, where these tactics are used, drug trafficking and things like that, infiltrating OCGs, organized crime gangs, one officer I spoke to described it as like weaponizing empathy. So what that basically means is to infiltrate a criminal gang, a organized criminal crime, organized crime gang or group, you have to start at sort of, how do I want to phrase this? You have to start with, the vulnerable drug addicts in order to get your contacts. So that's a very common tactic by undercover cops. They sort of start off with the most vulnerable, heroin drug addicts, things like that. And they were effectively lying to these people who weren't the targets of the operations, but they were used to get to the top and climb the criminal ladder. And that person dealt with quite a lot of guilt around that because he knew some who had died, who he felt perhaps, if he was helping that person rather than using them, then maybe something good could have come out of it. Um, but other undercover cops used things like alcohol to sort of cope, but it became, common, it became an addiction really for them. It became that standard coping mechanism because there wasn't much sort of support they could get elsewhere. But again, something that was really actually quite positive was that, many used exercise, they've done things like yoga, running, cycling, things like that. And most done it and most found it positive because it was sort of provided a bit of distraction, provided that, you can avoid the problem a little bit. But that definitely is something that needs to be balanced against, getting proper support from work, getting support from family, because all those things are really put at risk and they're all really threatened by the nature of the role. Going back to the guy who sort of made himself look really gaunt, made himself look really thin, his wife described him as, a predator, basically. His wife said, "You look like a predator," and didn't let him come to parents' evenings and things like that because of the way he looked. So that's a massive loss of support for someone in this role, really. It's really quite difficult for them to sort of rebound mentally from that. Now, some of the problems, of course, with my research, it's always good to be sort of thinking about what can be done better. And this is what sort of we try and do at university. We're always thinking about how can something be improved? How can we change? How can we do better and differently? So obviously I only spoke to a few people. That means it might not be relevant to all the other undercover officers that I haven't spoken to. Some wider background information, there is a undercover policing inquiry ongoing at the moment, and what that's based around is from the 60s onwards and predominantly the 80s 90s, there were units of undercover officers who were set up to infiltrate political groups. Now, what some of these undercover officers were doing, they were having relationships whilst being married and having children. They started to have sort of sexual relationships with women who weren't the targets of the operation. Not that it makes it okay if they were the targets, but they were fathering children as well. They were having children with these women. So that's sort of, this undercover inquiry ongoing at the moment that can really make access difficult. You know, again, we sort of need that wider information, the wider statistics around sort of well-being of undercover cops, because I only spoke to a few, as I've mentioned. Now, in terms of how research might look in the future, um, I think we need to think more widely about the wider prevalence of mental health and well-being in undercover officers. We need to get that large scale data set, that much more conversations going on with these cops. Another area is the role of female undercover officers. I only spoke to, so 2 out of the 5 I spoke to were female, and they were put at much, different risks than the male officers were. So it's all about, understanding that different impact on female undercover cops as well. And some other future focus, which, some of you in the chat might be thinking about, why isn't there more research on this? More research could be around what's called the spy cops scandal, which is, what that undercover statutory inquiry is all about at the moment. So that's pretty much an overview of my research.